Nobody should be able to witness a scene like that and simply move on without it haunting them. She was down on her knees in the cracked, sun-baked earth beside a crumbling stone well. Her dress was torn beyond recognition, her breath coming in fractured, desperate pulls, while a broad man crouched directly behind her and extended his hand toward the exact place she was fighting with everything she had left to protect. The Kansas flatlands had already turned the morning sun into something merciless, pressing down on the dusty plain like it owned the place. Grit had worked its way into every fold of her skin. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely keep herself from collapsing. When she felt him shift his weight toward her, a sound erupted from somewhere deep inside her, raw and splitting like something tearing loose from its roots. "Please, stop. Don't go near that. It hurts." She tried to drag herself forward, but her legs had already surrendered. Anyone who happened to ride past in that single frozen moment, catching just one still frame of what was unfolding, would have drawn a conclusion that could destroy a man's entire life. A young woman barely into adulthood and a grown, weathered man deliberately closing the gap between them. No witnesses. No law within reach. Nothing around them but heat, silence, and a choice that could ruin everything in the space of a single heartbeat. What makes this harder to sit with is that she genuinely believed what had happened before was about to happen again. That this man was going to do what the last one had done. And for one unbearable stretch of seconds, every signal in that scene pointed directly that way. Before we go any further, I want to be upfront with you. This story draws from accounts of the frontier era and has been carefully shaped and rewritten to preserve the human weight and emotional truth while carrying lessons worth remembering. All imagery in this video is AI generated to support the atmosphere and feeling of the story, not to deceive anyone. If heavy material is difficult for you today, give yourself permission to listen at whatever pace feels right. But if you are still here, stay with me, because what appears to be happening in these opening moments is not what actually happened. Let me slow this all the way down and tell it the way it deserves to be told. Because this story did not begin at a forgotten well on the Kansas plains. It started days earlier inside a house in Dodge City, where the curtains were kept drawn even at midday. It started with a young woman who had learned to move so carefully across the floorboards that they would not betray her. It started with a man who smiled warmly in public, prayed loudly at Sunday services, and reserved his worst self for the hours when no eyes were on him. Clara did not run because she was restless or reckless. She ran because staying meant slowly being erased, and the only thing she carried out of that house was not money, not a change of clothes, not even food. She carried a folded piece of paper that weighed almost nothing, but meant everything to the man who was already hunting her to get it back. Out on the frontier, water is never just water. It is currency. It determines who plants crops, who sells land, who remains, and who disappears without explanation. So when Elias stumbled upon her at that well, he was not simply discovering a wounded girl. He was stepping into the outer edge of a conflict no one had told him about yet. One that had already claimed him whether he had agreed to it or not. That well sat alone near the Cimarron River, a forgotten stone circle left behind by an old line camp that had long since outlived its purpose. Most riders passed it without a second glance. That morning, Elias Mercer had not planned to stop there at all. Elias was 49 years old, a cattle rancher who had lived long enough to understand the difference between trouble approaching and trouble that had already arrived. He had ridden out before sunrise to check water levels and fence lines before the heat made the work genuinely dangerous. That was when he saw her. At first, he thought she was dead. Her body was slumped against the stone, half collapsed onto the ground, hair matted against her neck with sweat, dress streaked with dust and something darker that he could not immediately place. He eased closer and she moved. Just barely. Her breathing came in short, uneven pulls, as though each one was costing more than she had remaining. Elias crouched slowly and kept both hands where she could see them. He spoke to her in a steady voice. She did not answer. When his fingers barely grazed her shoulder, she recoiled with a force that stopped him cold. The sound that came from her was not confusion. It was not anger. It was fear at its most elemental, the kind that lives inside a person's body long after the original source of danger has passed. That was when he noticed the blood. Not much. Just enough to tell him this was the kind of wound that arrived wrapped in shame someone else had forced upon her. He had treated many kinds of injuries out on this land. Gunshot wounds, deep cuts from wire, bones broken by falls. This was different in a way that settled heavily in his chest. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small tin of antiseptic and a clean strip of cloth. On the frontier, infection moved faster and quieter than almost anything else that could kill you. He moved into position behind her because the wound left him no other angle from which to help without making her pain significantly worse. That was when her voice fractured completely. "Please don't. That spot. It hurts." The words hit him like a physical impact. In that instant, Elias saw himself through her eyes entirely. Another man. Another shadow positioned behind her. Another pair of hands she had no power to stop. He froze. Then he pulled back immediately, both palms raised, and put several feet of space between them. He spoke low and level, not trying to soothe her, not trying to persuade her of anything, just telling her plainly that he would not touch her again. He told her he was only trying to prevent her from dying in that dirt. He set the cloth and the tin down beside her trembling hand, turned his face toward the open plain, and talked her through how to use them herself if she was able. She was not able. The heat had taken too much. The pain had run too long. Her fingers released their grip on the stone. Her body tilted forward and she began to go down. That was when Elias made the decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He moved anyway. Not past her fear, not past her dignity, but past the risk of being misread. He caught her carefully, called out toward the nearest homestead, and rode hard. A widow named Leahy Briggs reached the well not long after. The girl was burning with fever. Together they brought her to Elias's ranch, where Leahy tended to her properly and away from any man's involvement. But rumors on the frontier do not wait around for facts to catch up. They form faster, travel farther, and land harder. A lone rancher. A young woman found in torn clothing. A scene that required almost no imagination. To twist into something ugly, and lying unconscious. In the spare room was a girl whose pain had been caused by a man far worse than the one who found her. So here is the question worth sitting with before this story goes any further. If you had ridden past that well and caught only what a single terrible second could show you, would you have judged the man crouching there? Or would you have stayed long enough to learn why he never left? She did not open her eyes until late that night. The fever finally eased its grip, and her gaze opened and drifted closed again, slowly adjusting to the room. There was the scent of clean water and boiled cloth. For one panicked moment, her hand moved across her own body, checking herself, the reflex outrunning conscious thought. Nothing new had been taken. Nothing had been harmed while she slept. That was when she noticed the woman sitting beside her. Leahy Briggs was a widow with silver hair pulled back tightly and hands that worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades solving problems without waiting to be thanked for it. She had lived long enough on these plains to recognize a particular kind of suffering without needing it explained aloud. The girl attempted to sit up. Leahy pressed her back gently and told her there was no urgency. No expectation in her voice, just calm. Outside the room, Elias sat at the kitchen table, hat in both hands, elbows resting on wood he had built himself. He had not slept. He had replayed the scene at the well over and over, examining each second carefully, wondering how close he had come to making the wrong call for entirely right reasons. He understood how stories moved in a place like this. A young woman found in ruined clothing. A man found alone with her. Truth did not get a vote in what people chose to believe. Only the loudest version of events did. When Leahy finally stepped out and eased the door closed behind her, he looked up. She gave him a single short nod. She is alive. She will be. That was all he needed. Elias had buried a wife once, years before, taken by fever before their life together had properly begun. He had learned the hard way that some grief does not make an entrance. It simply takes a seat beside you and never quite leaves. That was why he did not rush Clara. And that was why he had not turned away when she needed him most. The girl slept through most of the following day. By the second morning, the fever had receded enough for her to sit upright without the room tilting. The fear had not left her eyes, but it had changed texture. She tracked everything: the door, the window, the distance between herself and whoever was nearest. Elias stayed visible and never closed the gap without a clear reason. He spoke when something needed saying and went quiet when it did not. He brought water, left food within reach, stepped back, and let Leahy handle everything else. Late that afternoon, the girl finally used her voice, rough and scraped like it had forgotten how to work. She asked where she was. Leahy answered. She asked who owned the place. Leahy hesitated, then told the truth. The girl went still. Elias waited. Eventually she asked his name. He gave it. Nothing more. An hour passed before she asked the question that had been pressing on her since the moment she first woke. "Why did you stop?" Elias did not pretend not to understand. He told her he had no right to enter a space she had not opened to him. He told her that fear was never the same thing as agreement. He told her that sometimes doing what was right meant accepting that people would assume the worst of you and living with that anyway. Her eyes filled then, not quite with tears, with something heavier, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. She told them her name was Clara Mayfield. She said it slowly, deliberately, as though she was verifying it still belonged to her. Clara did not release her full story all at once. Some pieces came out over the following hours. Others remained lodged somewhere inside and did not move. After her sister died of a summer illness, the house in Dodge City had turned quiet in a way that felt wrong. The kind of quiet that watches, the kind that gradually tightens around you. The wound she carried had not come from a fall. It had come from being cornered. From being told that no one would believe a girl who scrubbed floors in exchange for a roof. Elias did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He did not offer promises he could not keep. He simply listened. That alone seemed to surprise her more than anything else that had happened since the well. When she finished, she stared at the far wall and braced for the judgment she had learned to expect. It did not arrive. Instead, Elias asked one quiet question. "Who else knows?" Clara shook her head, then paused. Her sister had known something about land and water. Before she died, her sister had concealed certain documents and warned Clara never to let them fall into the wrong hands. Her sister had not simply been a bedridden woman in a sickbed. She had quietly maintained records from the time her husband filed a small land claim and had documented everything she observed about the water line. Out here, water was not a resource. It was leverage over people's lives. When men in town began asking uncomfortable questions, her sister had sealed the papers in a tin box and told Clara exactly where to find them. Clara had not stolen them. She had carried them because she was the last person her sister had ever trusted with anything that mattered. She reached under the blanket and produced a folded sheet, soft and worn from being opened and refolded too many times. It outlined a partial land claim near the Cimarron. Water rights, incomplete on its own, but valuable enough to make a desperate man dangerous. Elias felt the weight of it shift the atmosphere in the room. Outside, the afternoon wind delivered a sound he did not like. Hoofbeats, not close yet, but moving with intention. Back in Dodge City, Silas Crow stood in a doorway, his face composed, his voice measured, speaking to anyone who paused long enough to hear him. He said his sister-in-law had fled in her grief. He said a certain rancher may have taken advantage of her disorientation. He said he wanted nothing more than to see her brought home safely. Behind that carefully constructed voice was a different kind of urgency entirely. The papers were gone, and he had already formed a very clear idea of who was holding them. That night, Elias did something he had not done in years. He locked his door. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Clara lay awake in the dark and listened to the sounds of a place that was not reaching for her. She did not yet know whether she fully trusted Elias, but she understood one thing she had not felt in a very long time. She was not alone in the dark anymore. Morning arrived slow and heavy, the heat already pushing into the air before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Elias stood outside with a tin cup of coffee gone cold, listening to the land the way a man listens when he knows something is heading toward him, but cannot yet tell how fast. Clara had slept again. Poorly, but she had slept. That felt like something worth protecting. Elias knew he could not keep her at the ranch much longer. A rancher sheltering a young woman was the kind of story that fed on itself in a town like Dodge City. Too many eyes. Too many people willing to swap truth for a more satisfying version. By mid-morning, he had made his decision. They would ride into town, not to hide, not to flee, but to place her in front of someone with a badge and the spine to use it honestly. He told Leahy his plan. She did not argue. She only told him to choose his door carefully. In towns like this, she said, there are always two doors. One leads to justice, one leads to noise. They do not always look different from the outside. They rode before the heat peaked. Elias in front, Clara close behind, moving stiffly, holding herself as though every stride of the horse was its own negotiation. The road into Dodge City was crowded and dry. Wagons ground along. Cattle called out. Men leaned against door frames and watched everything without appearing to watch anything. Clara felt the pressure of those stares before she could see the faces. She pulled her hat brim lower and tried to disappear into the dust. Elias slowed just enough to keep himself positioned between her and the street. The town had already been prepared for their arrival. Silas had come first, planting his version of events in the fertile ground of boredom and suspicion. And Dodge City was exactly the kind of place where a well-told lie could take root overnight and grow into something solid. At the city marshal's office, Elias dismounted and helped Clara down with minimal contact. He knocked and waited. The marshal was not in. A deputy stood in his place, younger than the responsibility warranted, with restless hands and eyes that moved between Elias and Clara in a way that made the calculation transparent. Elias stated their purpose plainly. The deputy listened with half his attention, wearing a smile that had nothing warm beneath it. Elias understood too late that this man was not processing what he heard. He was calculating what advantage could be extracted from it. The deputy leaned toward Clara with a question she was not prepared for, moving too close as he did. Her breath shortened. Her hands began trembling in exactly the same way they had at the well. Elias stepped between them, not with aggression, with the quiet, unmovable certainty of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. The deputy's tone shifted. He said Silas Crow's name the way people say things they believe settle arguments. He said Silas had already visited. Said he was worried sick. Said his sister-in-law had not been herself since her loss, and that a certain rancher may have exploited that fragile state. He looked at Elias as though the verdict had already been carved in stone. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "No one will believe you." The words she had been told over and over inside that house, now echoing in an office that was supposed to represent safety. Elias read her face in an instant. He did not argue with the deputy. He did not raise his voice. He moved Clara back outside before the false story could set any further. They stepped into the street and walked directly into two men who had clearly been waiting for exactly that moment. Hands built like quarry stone, eyes aimed somewhere past basic consideration. The first blow came fast and without warning, a fist driving into Elias's ribs that expelled the air from him completely. He staggered but found his footing. The second man went for his collar. The fight that followed was not graceful, all elbows and boot heels in choking dust. Elias did not fight like a young man. He fought like a man who had survived long enough to understand that staying upright mattered far more than looking capable. He drove one attacker backward into a water trough. The second came back harder. Something snapped along Elias's side, hot and precise, but he stayed on his feet. A shout cut through the crowd noise. The two men stepped back and dissolved into the street as though they had never existed. No one in the gathered crowd intervened. No one moved to stop them leaving. Clara was pressed against a wall, chest heaving. Elias wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, straightened his hat, and moved them both off the main street without looking back. They found a narrow gap behind a feed store where the noise of the town thinned to something manageable. Clara's legs gave out. She slid down against the wall. Elias crouched a few paces away and gave her the space she needed. Neither spoke for a stretch of time. Then Clara said quietly, "He is not after me." "He is after what I am carrying," Elias nodded slowly. She drew the paper from inside her coat, hands unsteady, the same document she had shown him the night before, worn thin along the creases. He studied it again. Not enough on its own to build an airtight case, but more than enough to make a desperate man with resources genuinely dangerous. They could not remain in Dodge City. As they prepared to leave, Clara heard a voice she recognized before she found the face. Silas Crow stood at the far end of the street, unhurried and relaxed, speaking to a cluster of men. His eyes found hers across the full distance of the street. He smiled the way a man smiles when he believes every outcome has already been arranged in his favor. That was when Clara understood it fully. This was never only about what he had done to her behind those drawn curtains. This was about land, water rights, railroad money, and the control of all of it. And he had no intention of allowing her to walk away with the evidence. They rode out of Dodge City, beneath the unspoken weight of 100 conclusions already drawn about them. Elias kept his face forward. He could feel the pursuit assembling itself behind them like incoming weather. And as the town dissolved into the dust at their backs, one shared understanding settled between them without needing to be spoken aloud. Silas Crow would not stop. And the next time their paths crossed, it would not be on an open street with witnesses nearby. They did not ease the pace until Dodge City was nothing more than a ripple of heat at the horizon. Elias kept the horses at a steady rhythm, not from calm, but from the understanding that panic burns through water and time, and neither could be spared. The bruise in his ribs had deepened. Every full breath reminded him of the alley. Behind him, Clara rode as though she were made of something brittle, shoulders pulled inward, eyes scanning every crest and fold in the terrain. The frontier does not get told honestly in most stories. It gets painted in gunsmoke and bravado. The true version is mostly this: thirst, heat, exhaustion, and the slow arithmetic of how much further a horse can be pushed before it fails you. Elias watched the ground for tracks the way some men study a card table. He saw nothing yet, but he knew patience was not something they had in abundance. Silas had money and the loyalty it could purchase, or at least a convincing imitation of loyalty, and that deputy had looked at Clara the way men look at something they consider temporarily out of place. The land spread wide and pitiless as they turned, south toward the Cimarron, flat, enough that hiding was more a concept than a genuine possibility. Elias had worked cattle across these same miles years before, when his knees were more reliable, and his sense of his own luck ran considerably higher. They stopped at midday, only long enough to water the horses at a shallow river bend. Elias checked his ribs in the shade of a low cottonwood, while Clara rested and stared at nothing in particular. The pain was precise and unwelcome, but measurable. There was something almost useful about pain you could locate. It was the other kind, the kind with no fixed address that proved harder to outlast. They pushed on before anyone could follow their tracks back to the stopping point. By late afternoon, the land had broken into low, uneven hills. They came upon an abandoned line camp near the Santa Fe Trail, a sagging shed, a sun-bleached corral, and no sign of recent human presence. Elias chose to stop there for the night, not because it was secure, but because it was forgotten. And forgotten places are sometimes the safest ones available. Clara sat on a wooden crate and studied the ground while Elias tended to the horses. She had gone quiet since the street in Dodge City. The smile Silas had sent her across that distance had worked its way inside her and refused to leave. When Elias returned and handed her a tin cup of water, she accepted it. Then she looked up and told him there was something she had not yet shared. Her sister had not trusted the documents alone. She had deliberately divided the information. The second piece was not at the ranch and not on Clara's person. It was somewhere else along the old trail, concealed in a place that would never occur to someone without specific knowledge. Elias let the silence settle before responding. This changed the shape of everything. One document made Silas uneasy. 2 complete documents made him cornered. And a cornered man with resources and purchased loyalty was an entirely different kind of threat. Silas did not want that water for irrigation. He wanted it because larger operations and railroad interest were already circling the Cimarron region. Control the water line and you control all the land surrounding it. You could squeeze neighboring ranchers, sell access at whatever price you chose, and transform quiet geography into wealth that would last for generations. That kind of ambition does not leave loose ends alive. Night arrived slowly and stayed too quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of emptiness, but the taut, listening quiet of something waiting. There had been whispers along the Cimarron for weeks before any of this began. Small ranches roughed up or driven out, cattle vanishing without explanation. A few men found face down in the sand with no one choosing to know anything about the reason. That kind of atmosphere does not confine itself locally for long. Eventually it reaches the ears of men whose job is to notice it. Elias built a fire small enough to cook by, but not large enough to carry on the wind. They ate without conversation. Crickets held the silence. The horses shifted and sighed. Somewhere in the dark distance, a coyote called out and received no answer. Clara broke the silence eventually. She asked why he had stayed. Why he had not left her at the edge of town and returned to his own life. Elias looked at the fire for a long moment. He said some obligations arrive without a name attached to them. He said certain lines, once you chose not to cross them, defined the kind of man you were going to be for every year that followed. She nodded. She did not ask for more than that. Elias slept poorly. He surfaced at every unfamiliar sound. At dawn he saw them. Tracks pressed into the soft earth nearby. Too deliberate, too numerous to be accidental. Someone had moved through during the hours they slept. Not close enough to have spotted them directly. Close enough to confirm they were in the general area. They packed without discussion and rode at first light. The Cimarron ran low and pale, its banks cracked from the dry season. They followed it west, staying inside the brush wherever the cover allowed. By mid-morning they heard it beneath the ambient sounds of wind and moving water. Hoofbeats distant but rhythmic. Not cattle. Men riding with a fixed destination in mind. Elias did not panic. He did what he had always done when the pressure climbed. He thought. Outrunning a group on horses that were already tired was not a calculation that worked in their favor. Turning back meant riding toward Dodge City and everything waiting there. So he turned off the river and moved them toward higher ground where the terrain would narrow the options for anyone following. The riders held back, watching, waiting for the right moment to close the trap. Clara felt the pressure building in her chest. She asked if they were going to get through this. Elias waited before answering. He said they were going to do everything they could. By afternoon, the land had climbed into broken rocky hills. They came upon the remains of an old station house, collapsed on one side, the wood worn gray and rough as aged skin. Elias dismounted and searched the interior carefully. Behind a loose section of flooring, he found it. A small metal box, sealed tight with age and intention. Inside were papers more complete than anything Clara had been carrying. Names recorded with care. Dates that aligned precisely. Water rights outlined clearly and legally. Her sister's name at the bottom. Written with the kind of deliberate precision that belongs to someone who understood exactly what they were leaving behind and for whom. Clara sat down hard on the floor when she saw it. Elias folded the papers slowly and placed them inside his coat. Now they had something real. Now they had enough to bring a proper hearing before the right authority. And now there was no pretending the situation was going to resolve itself quietly. The riders appeared on the ridge above them not long afterward. 4 of them outlined against the sky. They did not charge. They did not call out. They simply positioned themselves and waited, applying pressure through presence alone. Elias and Clara mounted deliberately. The horses were tense and communicating it through every movement. He did not run. He moved them toward a narrow pass cut between the hills, the only route that offered any control over what came next. The riders followed at the same patient distance. As they entered the mouth of the pass, a second set of hoofbeats reached them from the opposite direction. For one brief second, something that felt like hope flickered. Then Elias saw who it was. The deputy from Dodge City. The same man with the easy, empty smile. He tipped his hat when he spotted them and said their names with the comfortable confidence of someone who believes he already knows how a story ends. The trap had closed completely. Riders pressing from behind. Corrupted law positioned in front. The pass offered no room to turn. Clara's grip tightened on the reins. Elias leaned close and spoke quietly. No panic, no rushing. Whatever comes next, remember this. We are done running. When Silas Crow stepped fully into view, time did not slow down so much as sharpen. The way everything becomes crystalline when you understand that the next several seconds are going to matter in a way that cannot be undone. Silas did not look like a man in crisis. He looked like a man arriving at a conclusion he had written in advance. His posture was easy. His horse stood calm beneath him. The deputy drifted closer, one hand resting near his belt, waiting for a signal. The riders at the rear sealed the remaining space. Elias had encountered men like this before. The ones who remained relaxed while everyone around them grew frightened were not the courageous ones. They were the ones who had arranged ahead of time for other people to bear the consequences. Silas spoke first. His voice was unhurried and measured, a man who believed the moment already belonged entirely to him. He said this could be concluded simply. He said Clara belonged back in his house. He said the documents she was carrying were never hers to hold. He said cooperation would make things considerably easier for everyone present. Elias listened to all of it. He was not listening for an opening to argue. He was watching hands and eyes, counting the distance between riders, and calculating what the rocks at the edge of the pass might offer if things moved fast. Clara felt the old compression return to her chest, the same narrowing of the world that had lived in her since the house in Dodge City. But something had shifted since the well. She did not lower her eyes. She did not allow her shoulders to collapse inward. Her heart was hammering hard enough to feel in her throat, but she stayed still and upright. Silas turned his full attention to her. He said she had caused more than enough disruption. He said her sister would not have recognized her behavior. That was when Elias spoke. Once, plainly. He said the papers were legal documents. He said they belonged to Clara by right of inheritance. He said there were people who had already seen them. Silas produced a thin smile. He said witnesses had a way of becoming unavailable over time. The deputy shifted his weight. That was the opening Elias had been watching for. He drew the folded papers from inside his coat and raised them openly in full daylight. Names, dates, water rights laid out in plain language, readable by anyone standing in that sun. Then he said one word, railroad. The writers stiffened. Even Silas's smile lost a degree of its certainty. Men who dismiss cruelty without blinking will pause for money without being asked twice. Those papers threatened interest considerably larger than one corrupt man's ambitions, and everyone present understood that without being told. The deputy reached for Elias. That was when Clara did something none of them had anticipated. She spoke. Her voice started unevenly. Then it steadied and kept going. She did not speak in vague terms. She used Silas's name. She stated the place. She described what had been done to her in that house with the curtains drawn, and what she had been told would happen to her if she ever spoke a word about it. She said it plainly, without decoration and without apology. The air inside the pass changed weight. One of the riders on the ridge looked away from the scene. Another adjusted his seat in the saddle, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly become uncomfortable. Silas snapped at the deputy to stop her. Too sharply, too fast. And the deputy hesitated, just for a single breath. But that breath was all that was needed. Elias moved. The fight that followed was not clean, brief, or dramatic in the way that stories usually describe these things. It was shoulder into ribs, boots scrambling on loose rock, a fist that missed by an inch, a man who hit the ground and did not get up again. Dust rose in heavy clouds. Horses screamed and pulled at their leads. Elias absorbed a blow to his already damaged side that very nearly brought him down, but he remained standing through sheer refusal, because he had decided falling was simply not what happened next. Clara pressed herself back against the rock wall and held the papers flat against her chest with both arms. Silas shouted for order. Nobody was listening to him anymore, and then a horse came in fast and hard from the upper ridge belonging to nobody's plan. A United States Marshal had been working the Cimarron region for weeks, quietly assembling accounts of intimidation, missing men, and land fraud. A hard-riding messenger had reached him in time. He took in the full scene without blinking. The deputy down, the scattered riders, a young woman clutching documents against a rock face, a man bleeding from his side but standing in front of her. Silas began talking immediately. Too much too quickly. A misunderstanding, he said. The rancher was dangerous. The girl had been unwell since her sister's passing. His voice had shed its earlier ease and was now working overtime. The marshal did not stop him. He walked directly to Clara and extended his hand. She placed the papers in it. Her hands were shaking enough that the paper rattled audibly. He read slowly and methodically, running his finger under names and dates, cross-checking them carefully. Then he looked at Silas and posed a straightforward question about the water claim, the kind of question any legitimate owner could answer immediately and without construction. Silas talked past it. He maneuvered around it with language built to obscure rather than clarify, and the desperation beneath the surface began showing through the seams. The marshal did not deliver a verdict standing in that pass. The frontier rarely operated that way. What he did was instruct Silas to dismount and come in for formal questioning, because the documents provided sufficient grounds to open a proper hearing, and that hearing was going to bring considerable outside attention to Dodge City. Silas did not move. The riders behind him considered their options in silence. Then one turned his horse and walked it away. Then another, and another, until Silas was sitting in that pass entirely by himself. The marshal placed a firm hand on his arm. Silas pulled back once. That was all the room he got. Iron cuffs closed around a man who had spent years believing that money made consequence optional. The deputy was disarmed. The remaining riders vanished back into the hills with the speed of men who had suddenly remembered prior commitments elsewhere. When the last sound of hooves faded, Elias leaned against the rock and allowed himself to breathe. The pain arrived all at once, as it tends to do when there is finally permission to feel it. Clara stood nearby, shaking from exhaustion and something she did not yet have a name for. The marshal told them plainly that this was not finished. There would be formal questioning. There would be a town that had protected certain interests for a long time and would not surrender them quietly. There would be people who chose never to believe her regardless of what the documents said, but the documents were real. And the truth had been spoken aloud, in the open, in front of a witness who carried federal authority. It could no longer be managed in private. The sun was lower now. The dust in the pass was beginning to settle, and as it did, both Elias and Clara arrived at the same understanding simultaneously. The worst was not entirely behind them. Justice on the frontier was slow, partial, and sometimes arrived at the wrong address. But something irreversible had happened. The truth had been spoken out loud, and that could not be taken back. The pass settled into the kind of quiet that follows something finally breaking open, rather than the kind that precedes it. Not peaceful, relieved. Elias rested against a rock and watched the light move across the distant hills. Clara stood a short distance away, holding the papers that had nearly been the end of both of them, studying them the way a person studies evidence that they survived something most people never see clearly. The marshal told them what came next would be neither simple nor swift. Land disputes and water rights hearings moved at their own stubborn pace. There would be men in Dodge City who would circle their wagons around old loyalties and familiar stories. Clara would face disbelief from people who had already made up their minds. The truth would have to be told again and again in different rooms before it began to accumulate the weight it deserved. But the point was never speed. The point was that something had been said aloud and documented in the presence of federal authority. It could no longer be handled behind closed doors. They rode back to the ranch without ceremony. No sense of triumph. No speeches. Just two exhausted people moving forward because forward was the only direction still available. The ranch felt different to Clara at first. Too exposed, too quiet in the wrong register. But over time the quiet changed its character. It stopped feeling like something lying in wait and started feeling like something that simply existed without agenda. Days passed. Then weeks. Clara healed unevenly, the way real healing works, with setbacks and stubborn knots that loosen slowly rather than snapping clean. The part that takes longest is never the visible part. It is the tightening of the shoulders when someone appears unexpectedly behind you, the way the throat closes around words that ought to come easily. The long process of separating present safety from past danger when the body has been trained not to trust the difference. Elias never pressed at any of that. He did not fill the available silence with reassurance or expectation. He repaired fence lines. He checked on the cattle. He left food where she could reach it, then stepped back. When she wanted to talk, he listened without offering commentary or solutions. Nothing more and nothing less than what the actual moment required. One evening, Clara walked out to the old stone well. The same one where the story had started, though the air surrounding it felt entirely different now. She lowered the bucket herself. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Elias watched from a distance that said present without saying hovering. That mattered, because genuine care does not announce itself through proximity. It announces itself through the particular kind of distance that says you are safe enough that I do not need to stand over you.